Alright, in today's video we are going to be talking about VORs. And VORs specifically for in terms of navigation and how they function. How to tune and identify a VOR, and intercepting and tracking a VOR course. So essentially, why do we want to use VORs? Well, VORs create a highway in the sky. They're going to be going out of date in the near future, I imagine, with the advent of all the GPS technology. But what is a VOR? A VOR, it stands for VHF, omnidirectional range. VHF meaning very high frequency. It's a radio beacon on the ground that allows an aircraft to identify their location relative to the VOR itself. Now, VOR navigation is a line of sight navigation system, meaning if we are on the ground and we were trying to pick up a VOR that's 40 or 50 miles away, more than likely we're not going to be able to pick up that signal until we are airborne. There are three different types of VORs, as we can see shown on different sectionals here. We have just a plain VOR. And then we have a VOR DME, which means it's coupled with distance measuring equipment. And then we have a VOR TAC, which is a VOR DME with military tactical air navigation, or TACAN, co-located with it. You can see some VORs or VOR TACs are positioned by themselves in locations, and some of them, as seen here, are co-located on the airport themselves. So inside the aircraft, the airborne equipment includes the navigation side of the radio, the VOR indicator. There's often two in the airplane, and an antenna for each VOR indicator. The VOR indicators in the airplane are commonly made up of, they'll have a CDI needle, or a course deviation indicator needle, and an omni-bearing selector. And this equipment allows us to receive the VOR signal and then interpret it and use it to figure out our position in relation to the station. So how does it work? How does a VOR work? Well, imagine a lighthouse. And a lighthouse, it has a rotating beacon. But whenever it passes through north, it flashes in all directions. If you were to time the time between when you see the flash and when you see the beacon, you could calculate your position. This is essentially the same thing a VOR does, but it does it with radio waves. In a more technical aspect, the VOR emits two VHF radio waves, one unchanging wave in all directions, so the flash from our lighthouse, and a second variable wave, our sweeping light beacon that's going around, the phase of which changes as it rotates. So the VOR receiver inside of the aircraft compares the phase of the rotating beacon to the reference, and that allows us to determine which radial from the station that the aircraft is on. So our next step in the process of using VORs is tuning to and identifying our VOR that we want to use. And we do this by, we get the VOR information from our charts, or the airport and facilities directory. And you can see here on our sectional chart, we can look down at the VOR we want to use, and in the box, we can get our VOR frequency. And then we will simply tune this frequency into the desired navigation radio, and we want to identify the frequency by using the supplied Morse code. And so once we have done that, we will be able to audibly confirm that that is indeed the correct VOR that we want to tune into and use. So once we have tuned to our VOR, we want to track and intercept a specific radial of the VOR. One thing we need to understand is that the VOR radials are emanating from the station. They're always from the station. You can think of a bicycle spoke, and the spokes are all coming out from the center hub of the wheel. So those are like the radials. They're always coming from the station, and they radiate in all directions. The radials are based on magnetic north, and since they converge at that center of the hub there, the closer we get to that hub, the more sensitive our tracking is going to be on that specific radial. All right, so here we're going to go over how we're going to intercept and track this radial of the VOR using this simulator. So here, imagine that we have our VOR that we have selected. We have tuned to and identified it using our information from our sectional or AFD and used our Morse code, and it is the right station. We're on a heading of 360 here, and we want to intercept and track the 090 degree radial inbound, or the 270 degree outbound. So we are going to track and intercept the 090 degree radial inbound. Our first step's complete. We've tuned to and identified the station. We're on a heading of north, but we need to do something with our CDI, our VOR indicator down here. And we want to make sure we are going on 090 to the station, as noted right here with our to from flag. You see right now we are tuned into the correct direction, which is going to be 090 to the station. Even though this is the 270 radial, we want to go 2, so we have to use its reciprocal. If we wanted to track outbound on this radial and go away from the station, we would be tracking and intercepting the 270 degree radial from the station. And now you can see here that that's dialed in and there is a from indication. But we don't want to do that. We want to go to the station. So we'll swing it back around to 090. Get it back on there. All right, that looks good. And as we start getting closer and closer to the radial, you'll see the course deviation indicator needle will start to swing in. Now, normally flying a 90 degree intercept course is not advisable, as you'll typically end up blowing right through it. But you can see here now we're getting closer to the radial and it's starting to come in. So we're going to go ahead and change our heading. And we'll change that to 045, do a 45 degree intercept. And you see as we start getting closer and closer, our needle starts to line up, which is exactly what we're looking for. We'll just go ahead and speed this up just a little bit. As we get closer to our radial and closer to our radial, it starts to get right there on the donut. And this would be a good time to go ahead and start our inbound course if we were on a 45 degree intercept. Now we're intercepted and we're flying inbound on the 090 degree radial with our to from indication in the to position like we want to see it. And we are correct sensing here. So if that needle is off to the left, like you see it here, we need to go to the left to center it back up. If that needle is way off to the right, we need to go to the right because we are off course. So that brings up the key of correct sensing versus reverse sensing in a VOR. So that's an example of correct sensing. Now we'll talk about what can happen if you don't have this set correct and it becomes reverse sensing, which is easy to do if we're not paying attention. So say we passed over the station and we want to continue to fly on the 090 degree radial outbound. But for some reason, we don't have our VOR needle set to 090 degrees from the station. We're set to 2702. Well, when we start getting off course here, you see we're off course to the right. Well, during correct sensing, we saw when the CDI was displaced, we needed to fly to it. Well, in this case, if we continue to fly to that needle, we're just going to continue to be off course. It's reverse sensing. So in this case, whatever direction the CDI is deflected to, we need to fly opposite that direction to center it back up. And you should never really intentionally do this. There are some exceptions whenever you're getting into instrument flying and flying back course approaches and things like that. But in regular VOR flying, you don't want to do this, and it wants to be avoided at all times. So we always want to make sure that we have the correct to from indication dialed in our OBS. An easy way to overcome that is you should ensure that your VOR course that you have selected generally should match the heading that you're flying. So if we're wanting to fly the 090 degree radial outbound or the 0902, depending upon which side of the VOR we are on, our heading and our VOR course selected should generally be the same. But as you can see here, we're reverse sensing. We have a heading of east, and our OBS is dialed into 270, which should be an indication that we're going to be reverse sensing. The other thing we briefly discussed earlier was the closer we get to the station, the more sensitive the needle is going to become. So it could be a nice, calm, still day. And as we start getting closer to the station, you'll notice it's going to become slightly more difficult to maintain your current course, even though you may not be deviating from what you're flying. It's just becoming more sensitive. As you can see here, we're on the, let me change this back around to our 0902. All right, so we're on the 0902, the station, and we're getting close to it. You can see here the closer we do get to it, it's starting to deviate away slightly, even though we're not deviating. And that's just because the closer you get, the more sensitive it is. Until we eventually reach station passage. And station passage is going to be indicated by the first full flip of the to from indicator. So the first right there would be station passage. We're going to, and then now we're going from. And once again, it'll be sensitive, and then it'll stabilize back out once we're established outbound on that correct radial. The other thing we need to discuss whenever we're talking about tracking and intercepting VOR radials is the effects of wind. So we'll have to apply a slightly different concept in order to compensate for wind while we're tracking. So suppose we were asked to intercept and track the 270 degree radial to the station. So we have that dialed in, 270 degrees to. That looks good. We're on the radial, but there's a 20 knot wind coming from the north. So as you can surmise, that wind is going to want to blow us off of our course. Let's just see what that looks like. You can see here as that wind is continuing to blow, we're slowly being drifted off course here. So in order to correct for that, we need to change our angle at which we're flying. So here we changed it to 290, and that seems to be a bit much. Now we're getting back up, so we'll change it to 280. See if that maintains our track. You have to essentially kind of bracket your flight path to find out which one is going to keep you flying that radial. You can see down here we're still flying. We're off course to the left a little bit, but that 10 degrees offset seems to be holding us pretty good on course. And as we start approaching closer to the station, we're flying in a pretty straight line. You can see again, if we were to change our course back to 270, we're going to begin to drift back off. So we would need to apply that 10 degrees back. And there it is again. And that stabilizes our course inbound.